Okay, to all those of you who are joining, thank you very much for joining this second in our series of Isolation Insight events brought to you by UK and Changing Europe and the Wonders of Modern Technology. Today we're going to be talking about populism and the pandemic. When I put those two keywords into Google, as I want to do, it produced 2,570,000 results. I carefully combed through each and every one of those to discover that there were essentially three basic responses. The first response was that populists and populism will benefit from the pandemic. The second response was that actually the pandemic would end up doing for populism and the populists. And the third response was, well, it's actually all a bit more complicated than that. Now, as an academic, I'm always inclined to the third explanation, complexity, but maybe that's just me. So I'm hoping to gain a little bit more certainty and certainly a lot more insight with the help of three of my favorite fellow academics, all of whom happen to be absolute experts on populism. Before I introduce them, however, I just thought I'd say a little bit about what we're talking about here. I'm going to define populism as an ideology which essentially pits the people against a corrupt elite. Now, that definition of populism means that it can be applied either to the left or to the right, although it has to be said that it tends in academia and indeed the media to be applied more to the right wing than it does to the left wing, and it's very often associated with nativism, with xenophobia and nationalism. But we can go on to talk a little bit more about how we define things as well as the consequences of the pandemic for populism as we begin to talk a little bit more. First up, though, I'm going to introduce each of our panel. We're going to hear, first of all, from Matt Goodwin, who many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with. He is Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, and he is also the author of a book from Penguin that's out now and is doing very well, National Populism. And then we're going to be hearing from Catherine Fieschi, who heads up the Global Policy Institute at my very own Queen Mary University of London. And she is the author of the book, and I'm going to mispronounce the first word, I know, Populocracy, The Tyranny of Authenticity and the Rise of Populism. And then we have Paul Taggart, a former colleague of mine at the University of Sussex. Paul has an unerring knack for spotting things that academics are going to be talking about in the future. The most obvious of these perhaps is Euroscepticism, which Paul has published on extensively. But he also published back in 2000, so 20 years ago, Paul, not that I want to make you feel old, a book simply entitled Populism. He's also the author of a big book on the subject, an editor of the big book on the subject, the Oxford Handbook of Populism, which is basically everything you always wanted to know about populism, but were too afraid to ask. But as those of you who know UK and Changing Europe well know, we're not too afraid to ask anything. So I'm going to start off by asking Matt Goodwin to talk for around 5 minutes about his view on this particular topic. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Tim, and good morning to everybody who's joined the call, and thanks as well to Paul and Catherine for the conversation. So, in a way, I wanted to start by thinking about this crisis by going back to the last crisis. And I suppose of the three views that Tim laid out at the start, I would say that it's a lot more complicated than populism is going to lose or populism is going to be the big winner. It's a bit like trying to make sense of the impact of the Great Recession in the aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. At that point, we really wouldn't have seen all that was going to follow over the next decade. And that decade, as we now know, really became a decade of heightened political volatility, fragmentation and the consolidation of national populism. It was a decade that saw Brexit, the decade that saw Trump, the decade that saw the breakthrough of various populist parties in Europe and further afield. And as Roger Eatwell and I argued, it was a decade that really saw the sharpening of many of the underlying divides that had been coming before the Great Recession. I think were then exacerbated by that crisis, and there are good reasons now to expect those to be further widened by the Great Lockdown. But I'm actually going to argue today, just as a thought experiment, I just want to push back against the idea that what we're going through now is going to be a big breakthrough moment for populism. And there have been a few studies already that have been pointing to that outcome. And I just wanted to outline, as a thought experiment, 4 points as to why I don't think that populism will end up being the big winner. The first relates to the hierarchy of needs and Abraham Maslow's famous dissection of the motivations that drive humans that has informed much of our work on value change. And we know that in general, it's economic prosperity and affluence that has allowed human beings to focus on those higher level needs of esteem, social status, and recognition. But actually, what this crisis is doing is pushing us back down the hierarchy of needs to those basic concerns over economic security, but more essentially, physical security. What's different between the Great Lockdown and the Great Recession, I think, is that the Great Recession was a double crisis that was political and economic. The Great Lockdown is a triple crisis that focuses on politics, economics, and health. And we know that different groups are going to have very different experiences. We know that the insulated and the sheltered professional middle classes will have a fundamentally different experience from this crisis than left behind workers. We know that in the short term, social isolation is compulsory, but in the longer term, it will be voluntary and it will become an economic luxury. But I don't think that those workers will inevitably or necessarily turn to populism, because if we're going to see anything, I think it's going to be the return of those big economic questions over redistribution, taxation, inequality, and wealth, who pays for what, rather than those identity culture questions that have dominated for much of the past decade. My second key point really relates to something that Tim has already mentioned, which is the anti-establishment nature of populism. If we go back to the last crisis, that crisis was top-down. It started in the liquidity markets and then hit workers a little bit later on, whereas this crisis is very much bottom-up. It's as we now know from research in the UK and the US, it's hitting low-skilled service sector workers, gig economy workers, low-educated workers much harder than it is hitting the professional middle classes, and that will accelerate, I would argue, as we go into exit strategies and start to come out of lockdown. But what's interesting for me, at least, is that it's much easier to blame the financial markets and politicians, as the populists did when they were seen to be in cahoots, than it is to blame the state when it is the state that is coming to the rescue on not one but two different occasions. Right? For current generations of voters, they will have seen the state not only come to the rescue during the Great Recession, but more importantly, they are now having a direct experience of the state coming to the rescue, paying their wages, keeping them going during a much more fundamental, essential crisis. Fiscal conservatism and economic liberalism were two of the earliest victims of this crisis. And so I think that if anyone is going to get the blame, it won't necessarily be establishment politicians per se, but I think actually it may be other actors in society. I can think of the wealthy, for example, coming under much greater scrutiny as people go through these very different experiences of the crisis. If you think, for example, about the Richard Branson debate in the UK, if you think about Denmark, France, and Poland and how they've handled state aid for offshore businesses, if you think about the discussion in the US about so-called quarantinis and the wealthy moving out to their second homes, if this is going to exacerbate these social divides, it may exacerbate them in a way that actually benefits movements on the left And one hypothesis that's kind of hanging over this crisis is this what social democracy needs to get back in the game? Is this crisis actually going to create more room for social democrats to now, re-establish their relationship with voters, an ideology that's been in crisis since the mid-2000s? Will it further entrench and help green movements that have been, green on the outside but red on the inside? And will it push these questions of economic reform to the forefront? And lastly, immigration. James Denison and Andrew Geddes have written a very interesting piece in the last few days about how the salience of migration has fallen, not just in the UK, where since the vote for Brexit, we've seen immigration fall out of the top 10 issues, but actually across Europe, we've not only seen the salience of immigration fall, but we've seen attitudes become more positive. That, to me, suggests that kind of demand side element that's crucial for populism is now going to become become a lot more challenging for these parties. But also added to that, one of the narratives that we've seen emerge, particularly in the UK, is the critical importance of migrant workers for navigating this crisis. And the national discussion has moved away from migrants as a threat to migrants as and ethnic minorities, established citizens, as contributing to public services and to the national community, and valuing that contribution in a much bigger way. And we won't know for a long time. I'd love to have a natural experiment in the field right now, but what is the experience of a population coming out every week to celebrate and recognize the contribution of key workers, many of whom are ethnic minority, migrant backgrounds? Will that lead to a substantial change in attitudes that will undercut populism, perhaps? The only point against that, Tim, which is my last point, is the one thing we are seeing in surveys across Australia, India, US, and UK, and Europe is a hardening of anti-China attitudes. There is another kind of hypothesis that's hanging in the air, which is, will this crisis lead to a much greater politicization of China, which until now has been a trading economic challenge in the public mindset, but now may become what we've not really seen since the Cold War, which is a systemic threat? And will that heightened perception of China as a broader threat, not just to economic markets, but to ways of life and values, will that actually give populists what they've not really had since the Cold War, which is a much broader external threat to the national community? So there's not, it's not one or the other. I think inevitably this is going to be complicated with lots of different points coming into the debate. But that's just to get us going with the discussion. So thanks for now.
That's great. Thank you very much, Matt. That's a great deal of food for thought already. Catherine, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for kicking us off, Matt. I suppose that one of the questions we need to ask is what do we mean? What do we mean by the pandemic? Do we just mean the health crisis? And how do we think about the consequences of this health crisis when the health crisis mutates potentially into an economic crisis and then potentially into a social crisis? So I think that the first thing that's obvious is that those populist parties, particularly in opposition, and I will go back to that in a minute, that tried to kind of make hay around the health crisis, pointing to the failures of keeping the borders shut, the failures of globalization, et cetera. Those parties, whether it be Salvini initially or Marine Le Pen in France, they didn't do particularly well by being strident on this. They actually lost not a lot, but lost 3, 4, 5 points. And so on, as in a sense there was a rally around the governments and the heads of state. That didn't last terribly long. It's very interesting that even in places, for example, like Italy, where Conte all of a sudden, saw his popularity and his legitimacy, rise to unprecedented levels. once first of all, the gravity of the health crisis dawned on Italian citizens, and once, of course, governments everywhere, but including the Italian government, started to struggle with the pandemic, as any government, any public sector would, that, you know, there was an erosion of popularity. But much more to the point, which I think is, you know, is probably going to be an example that we're going to see repeated elsewhere. Once the conversation started to shift toward, you know, the role of Europe, the role of European institutions, whether or not there was any solidarity with Italy, whether there were echoes of mistreatment or disdain toward Italy. Once that started to become more prevalent, then you could see, you know, actually, you know, a kind of a rise in support for populists and an erosion to some extent of Conte. We're still at a time where, and I would agree with Matt on this, which is that, you know, to some extent, I don't think that this is going to be a massive shake-up in favor of populists at this point. But I would say that whereas health crisis won't benefit populists in opposition, you know, certainly, you know, an economic crisis and a social crisis can actually, you know, again, worsen those divides that we've talked about before, and which Matt mentioned. So there is this notion here, I think, which is important, which is that to some extent, I feel that, you know, we grant this virus, you know, powers that it doesn't have, and you know, and to some extent, it sort of gives us amnesia. One of the things that, you know, we're going to see is that this may not be, at least not immediately, you know, this massive ideological reset. You know, there's going to be a sense in which we're going to pick up where we left off to some extent, and where we left off in Europe. And I think this is important, is, you know, a sense of, you know, across European countries, you know, strife, strikes, polarization, you know, and in a sense, a set of very volatile contexts. I think that it's worth talking about whether the populists are incumbents or in opposition. This it seems to me is extremely important, because to some extent, I know this is a slightly slapdash characterization, but you could argue that, you know, you've got populists in power in the UK, populist light potentially, you know, and a populist in power in the US. And I think that this is one of the things about this crisis that we shouldn't miss, if you like, this pandemic that we shouldn't miss, which is that it's a symmetric shock. You know, however asymmetric the consequences, and it allows us to see things about populism that perhaps weren't quite so obvious before. And one of the things that is really obvious is that, first of all, for the populists in power, what you have is a situation which is both irresistible to them, but also highly dangerous. It's completely irresistible because a crisis is a spotlight. And, you know, in the case of Boris Johnson, in the case of Trump, they're not only populists, they're raging narcissists, right? And so to some extent, they're going to be drawn to the spotlight. They're going to be drawn to the stage, which is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. So I would argue that, you know, combination of personality and being the incumbent in this case isn't necessarily going to do you any good. I was looking at, you know, the polls around Trump, and I think it's interesting that you know, we do see that, you know, he has taken a knock, and also he's taken a knock in some of the really crucial constituencies, particularly with older people. You know, this is the coronavirus crisis doesn't do somebody who's, you know, quite reliant on older voters any good. So I think we need to you know, to make that distinction, that you know, that is important. So where you're an incumbent, populist or not, This is not very good for you, because no matter how well you're handling the crisis, and I would argue, I would even make this argument with respect to Germany, the fact is that you're going to end up being an incumbent with, you know, huge levels of debt. You could always argue that it could have been worse, but the fact is that it's really very hard to win elections or maintain stability on these counterfactuals. If you're in opposition, I don't think it's going to do you any harm, and I think it's probably, as a populist, and I think that you know, we should see that it might in fact help a little. I just want to conclude on two, you know, or rather one quick point, which is about really the looking ahead bit. And we ask ourselves, you know, is populism, you know, going to do well out of this, or is it not going to do well out of this? I think to some extent what we're going to see, which matters more, is I agree, potentially, you know, a return of a much more powerful state, and you know, and I would like, you know, I hope that, as Matthew said, you know, this could be an opportunity for social democracy. On the other hand, you know, I would argue that, you know, an awful lot of reliance and hopes are going to be placed on governments who will have spent an awful lot of money, who will be highly indebted. And I question their possibility of being able to act as decisively or with the room for maneuver that many citizens would expect. And I think that to some extent, it's the potential for that disappointment, not just to keep, you know, to pour more money in, but actually also to deliver on some of the deep system change that I don't think people will have forgotten about. I think, you know, there will still be demands placed on government, for example, around climate. There may be new generational demands as well. Whether any of the governments that we're talking about in democracies, in developed democracies in particular, will be able to actually deliver on this is a huge question for me. And if they don't, and if polarization rises, and inequality in particular becomes more apparent, then, you know, I wonder whether this doesn't actually, not necessarily in the short term, but in the medium term, actually benefit various populist options that may look slightly different from the ones that we have now.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That's great. Paul, on to you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to those of you watching and listening. I appreciate you being here, and really thoughtful comments from both Matt and Catherine. I'm slightly alarmed at how Catherine managed to see my notes. I was going to say a couple of very similar things about government and opposition. I think that's important to make. So something I had to say will reinforce that. Let me just go back a bit. I mean, what's the effect of the pandemic on populism? Well, obviously, you know, to quote Zoom Lai, it's too soon to tell. We don't know yet. We're just coming out the top of the curve. So this is an ongoing process. So let me just start by saying one thing, which is that I think, you know, let's look back. What is populism at the moment, and what do we know about it? I mean, the one thing I would want to emphasise is that populism is quite plural. There are lots of different populisms in Europe and across the world. And Tim, you pointed to the difference between left and right, but even on the right, there are different emphases and there are different agendas. There's different success rates, and as Catherine's pointed out, some are in power and some are not. So I think it's very dangerous that we see populism as a blob. It's not a blob. It's quite differentiated as an experience, and that has been the case even before the pandemic. And the other thing I'd say about populism is it's not, to me, the key thing is that it's obviously about anti-establishment, speaking the name of the people, but it's also a particular view of politics and a certain distaste of politics. Catherine, in her book, talks about the rise of authenticity. It's trying to reclaim a different form of politics. Okay, so there's something more than just being anti-establishment and pro-people, because that's fascist, that's communist. You know, all that. Lots of people can fit under that category. There's something about populism, how it dislikes politics, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I differ from Catherine. I don't see the current British government as a populist force. I don't even see Brexit as a populist phenomenon. I think there are populist elements there, but I think we should be more limited about how we use it. But okay, so the the second thing I'd say is the same thing that Catherine was saying. We're talking about the pandemic. We're talking about, I think, two crises. We're talking about the health crisis, and I would say we're talking about the economic crisis. Now, if you just unpack a little bit what we might expect on those two aspects, I think that's what we can usefully do. In terms of the health crisis, how should populists, how would we expect them to react to it? Well, the health crisis across the world has done some things that really shot the fox for populism. First of all, it privileges expertise. Expertise is back on the table. We want to hear what the doctors, the experts say about health. That really matters. That's important. It empowers the establishment. The establishment is who we turn to. We don't suddenly say, right, oh, well, we're unhappy with you all. We know that the governments are going to have to do something about it. We know that those governments are more supported. That the rally around the flag effect, which we know from our research, is a very common feature in wars and this sort of crisis. It's short-lived, perhaps, but while it's living, it's quite powerful. And also, it actually nationalises politics. The response to the health crisis has been a national response. It's even shown the Eurosceptic element, well, actually, it's shown that free movement of people can be shut down pretty damn quickly when you need to do it. Nations can reassert themselves. If you're a Eurosceptic, you say, oh, I think I saw Daniel Hannan say the nation state's back. Well, I don't think it ever went anywhere. But the pandemic reinforces the power and the importance of nation states. In a sense, that's what a lot of populists in different guises have been seeking for. It's what Matt and Roger talk about in their conception of national populism. So the health crisis actually is quite complicated. It takes away a lot of the grievances, or it mutes them for a while, and it empowers the populist enemies in ways that are we might not expect. The only thing I would say is that you do see the rise of conspiracy theories. I think is a kind of populist trope. It's not something that necessarily occurs, but and again, that to me comes around from the populist dislike of politics in a way. Oh, it's got to be something else going on. Can't just be the complicated, messy world of politics. But in all other respects, the health crisis is pretty bad for populists. I think there's no question of that, whether they're in power or not in power. I suppose if they're in power, they're getting a bit more rally around the flag effect. The second crisis, the economic crisis. I mean, Catherine talked about an economic and social crisis. I just focus on the economic crisis and say, we don't normally know these things are coming, but we know this is coming. And the power of an oncoming economic crisis of various dimensions for different countries will be very significant. We know that is going to come. And that's where Matt started, quite rightly, in a sense, right? How can we interpret the response to an economic crisis, looking at how populists respond to previous economic crises? An economic crisis will be divisive, and the responses to them will be different in different European states. Different across the world. So there's probably much more purchase that the populists can get there if they want to. If they're insurgent figures, if they're government figures, then they'll probably be damaged by that. So, I'm going back to your point, Tim. The story is complicated. I mean, I think I would say the key thing is that in the future there will be some sort of substantial political blowback from what is going on now, both the health crisis and the economic crisis. How that carries out depends upon some extent the success or failures of different states and the different agendas of different populists and the different statuses of whether they're in government or not. All the blowback won't be populist. There'll be a lot of non-populist blowback. Again, to go to Matt's point about social democracy, that could be the blowback in some states. We need to be careful not to see populism sort of absorbing everything. So populism will have a very differentiated, I think, response to this according to how these two effects play out and interact in the different states that we see them at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. We'll now throw it open to discussion and some questions from me, but also some questions from our audience, and I'll do my best to address some of those. Actually, someone has asked something that I was thinking of asking Matt about anyway, which was, I think you make a very good point when you say that the image in some ways of migrants may have shifted during this pandemic, from one of, if you like, parasites, as far as some people who are opposed to migration see them, to one of heroes for many people, particularly with regard to their role as key workers and particularly with regard to their role in the NHS. However, as one of our audience has pointed out, come the economic crisis that will surely follow the pandemic, may it not be the case that that shifts once again as these people who have recently entered the country are seen as competing for very, very scarce jobs. And will that, in fact, not be something that plays to the advantage of populists? And I'm not just talking about the UK here, obviously, but also about other countries in Europe. Matt, what do you think?
I think it's entirely possible. In some ways, that's what we saw play out over the previous decade. It was the sort of potent cocktail of economic insecurity, wrapped up with the refugee issue that really provided quite an opening for national populists in Europe. And of course, that latter issue is still not resolved. It's not resolved within the European Union. And increasingly, you can see how populists in the UK are beginning to navigate around that issue, in terms of what's happening on the Kent coast. And it's not difficult to see how that issue comes back. But my suggestion, perhaps my hope, is the parameters of that conversation, I think, have now changed. We are now in a world where we have a prime minister who publicly thanked nurses and doctors from other countries for saving his life, which might be an idealistic observation, but it's one that you can see how that trickles into our public and political debate. The next time somebody challenges immigration, the inevitable response from all of our mainstream political parties will be, yes, but look at what just happened in this crisis. And I think the parameters of that conversation will change. The social norms of that conversation, I think, will be a little bit more different. And of course, in the UK, this is also taking place against the backdrop of an immigration policy that is already changing. We are already beginning to move to a sort of point-based system, where the incumbent government will be able to have a more meaningful response to people who say, well, immigration is out of control and look at all of these people coming in, etc. I think the government, the whole dynamics of that conversation will change. But Paul and Catherine may have further thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, one further thought actually that I have is, of course, there's always been this tendency to distinguish between good immigrants and bad immigrants, as it were, and also between immigrants based on their ethnicity. So coming back to something that you said, Matt, actually, about China, and of course you were talking about China in a kind of geopolitical sense, but we could well find that the attitudes of people to particular immigrants from particular countries, will disadvantage some rather than others. And of course, we're already seeing incidences of, racism against, people of Chinese extraction in Britain and perhaps also in other countries, as far as I know, rise. Whereas, discrimination and racist incidents, against immigrants from other ethnicities, seem to have fallen as attitudes have become a little bit more positive. Okay. Well, I did also have a question for Catherine, actually. I mean, you and Paul both mentioned, the fact that opposition and government dynamics are very, very important. And you, Catherine, seem to be suggesting that almost any incumbent government, which is going to be faced with this economic crisis, is going to find it difficult to avoid the blame for that. But aren't populists particularly expert at blame shifting, if you like? Aren't they very, very good traditionally at being able to say, well, it's not my fault, but it's the fault of the establishment, or it's the fault of migrants, or it's the fault. So aren't populist governments, some people would say, in some senses, probably kind of better at getting out of the bind, which I think you quite correctly identify for any incumbent government?
Yeah, I mean, So I think if we look at who the incumbents might be, right, and there's a slight question mark on whether or not the current British government is populist. I have a smaller question mark over that, but I agree that it's not clear cut. But if we look at Trump, or we look at Bolsonaro, to some extent, and we see that they. It goes back a little bit to that point about crisis, right? So that on the one hand, you're right. Populists are good at blame shifting. They're not as good at blame shifting if they're in power, and in a sense, in this case, they are implicated up to their necks and making very obvious public decisions. I do think that this is one of the cases where we're not overstating the power of this crisis and the framing of this crisis. It is a very particular moment, and I think that to some extent it's going to be harder to shift the blame. I also think that it goes back to this idea that that many of them are actually whether it's Trump or it's Johnson or it's Bolsonaro. Particularly Trump and Johnson, when I say they're raging narcissists, by that I mean that, the point of being in power is not necessarily a deeply ideological one, but it is about themselves. It is about the stage that they occupy, and therefore they will grab the mic, with rather disastrous consequences, right? I mean, utterly disastrous consequences, for Trump, where you have to shuffle him off the stage and tell him that, really just be quiet. But, not terribly good consequences for Boris Johnson either, right? I mean, he's managed to keep his popularity up. I think his illness, helps him in that respect. But the fact is that, he's not coming across, and his government isn't coming across as terribly convincing. So I do think that this crisis, because of the heavy involvement of government, is actually going to be one that it's going to be harder for them to shift the blame off of.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Paul, question for you. You, like the others and like many commentators, have mentioned the fact that, expertise is back, and that this group, who populists often criticize, are possibly the people who are going to save us in this current crisis that we face. Do you think that can be overdone, though, in the sense that clearly if the experts on whom the government are relying don't give the right advice, or the response that they suggest doesn't actually pay off, won't that give populists another chance, actually, to say, well, you listen to these guys, what good did it do you?
Yes, I think it will. In the long term, that's almost an inevitability. I mean, the thing about the dislike of expertise, it's a rather sort of trite statement. Actually, to be honest with you, if you look through populists in history, a lot of them quite like expertise. So it's a bit of a generalisation. I'll actually flip it around and say, why do they dislike experts? Or if they do dislike them, it's actually about the wisdom of ordinary people. And that's what populism has, this gut feeling that, we really know what we need to do. We really do know what we need to do. And I think that for these kind of moments of this pandemic, of the health crisis, that's actually quite difficult to say. In other words, we don't quite know exactly when we should release lockdown. We don't quite know what the R rates are. So we are very beholden upon elites at that level. So you're right. It only has a limited purchase about expertise can work against you. But it's more about that kind of that instinct to devalue politics at a national level. Can I answer something that Catherine said, or just build on what she said before?
By all means.
I mean, your point about the difference between government, populists and government. So obviously we think of places like Hungary and Poland and obviously Trump in the US. I think my sense of populism, when it gets into power, it has one of three strategies. It either tries to limit its populism, it kind of rolls back on its populism and it becomes more normal, more mainstream or whatever. or it actually reshapes the institutions. It actually says, well, no, we need to shape things and it changes the institutions so that it can have more effectiveness. It actually, you see that much more with Latin American populists. The third strategy is the strategy which I would sort of call, is it the Mae West, and hang on for a bumpy ride, and politics, you behave like the opposition when you're in government. Now, if you take those three strategies of how populists cope with being in power, and then you throw in a crisis, I think it shows, for example, why Trump is having great difficulty, because he's the third of those strategies. I'm going to behave oppositionally. But theoretically, the pandemic gives you an opposition. It gives you, if you're Trump, it's a Chinese virus and so on. But actually, it's very difficult to maintain that politics as a sustained moment. And therefore, it kind of forces others, I think, more populists. If you see, I think the case of law and justice in Poland is very interesting. How they have managed to maintain their position in power, and it's a very statist form. It's actually giving very generous welfare benefits, as a kind of left-wing populism, combined with the cultural right-wing populism. So they have a very different response to being in power, and again, the divergent conceptions. But I think putting the crises into governments and being populist can be very tricky.
Okay, thank you very much. Talk of the left brings me back actually to Matt's point about who might benefit from this and it not being populists, but actually social democrats. But I also wondered to some extent whether there is a kind of, left populist response to this. I mean, obviously, when we talk about populism in the media and academia, we very often associate it with right-wing parties. But clearly, there is such a thing as left-wing populism, and people often point to Spain or point to Italy. So I wondered, Matt, if you could, just think about this. And you talked about thought experiments. How could a kind of left populist strategy, either pursued by a kind of far left party or by a mainstream social democratic party, work out well for such a party?
Well, I think it could be a very prosperous time for left-wing movements, left-wing populists, for a variety of reasons. Catherine mentioned, what to me is the critical point about this crisis, which is the return of the state, the expansion of the state. We are entering into, whether we like it or not, an era of big government, of a more interventionist government. And I've seen people make the argument that if you put this into a much broader context, that you could argue that, the first big crash of the 20th century, 1929, really paved the way for a much bigger state, the New Deal in America, welfare states in Europe. You then fast forward to the 1970s, it had become clear that the state had overreached and exhausted itself, and that paved the way for Thatcherism and Reaganism. You fast forward to 2008 again, and we see the Great Recession really be the end result of the market overreaching. And that, combined with this crisis, was really paving the way for a much bigger state. And the question now, I think, is, well, particularly for my students, for example, by the time they reach 25, they will have seen two global financial crises and a global pandemic. And who has come to the rescue in both of those crises? It's been the state. And I think then you're going to have these generations of voters, firstly, that are going to be used to a much bigger government, that are going to be looking to government for the answers on climate, as Catherine said, but also on a whole array of issues around economic redistribution, which I think is going to have all kinds of interesting cohort effects. Economic liberals, the Dan Hannons, the free marketeers are going to have to make their case all over again to a generation that can't really remember what life was like, didn't know what life was like prior to the Great Recession. And that could, if social democrats and left populists are clever, that could be, that could open the door for their return to say, well, look, now is the time to really do all the things that we should have done a decade ago to help the groups that got battered by the last crisis and are now going to get hit again by this crisis: low income, low skilled, service sector workers, less well educated workers. The Resolution Foundation today pointing out how GCSE level education versus university level education, that those two groups are going to have incredibly different experiences of these crises. You're going to see the percentage chance of degree holders their employment prospects are going to drop by about 6%. But for the least well-educated groups, they're going to drop by about 27 to 30%.
Wow.
So you're going to see those very same groups that have been most receptive to populism really be hit quite hard again by this crisis. And so for left-wing populists, you know, the no-brainer is to come out and say, you know, this is the moment now to use this opportunity to deal with the deep economic questions that we should have dealt with a decade ago, because we've got used as political scientists to saying the left-right divide doesn't matter anymore, that it's all about values, it's open versus closed. Actually, I mean, I'd never really believed that. I think the left-right divide may actually come back with a vengeance, and if the left is clever, it could use that to its advantage.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Now, I mean, I'm going to actually move on to Catherine, partly because of that. The two countries that you know very well, Italy and France in particular, obviously have far left parties as well as far right parties. If you had to look at those two countries, and, you know, why don't we have a look at a couple of case studies? You've already mentioned Salvini. I mean, do you see any potential there for as it were, the populists on the left in French politics and maybe in Italian politics as well, and you can talk to this as well, the populists on the right?
So it's really interesting because, I mean, in the case of Italy, we tend to have slightly forgotten, but actually, you know, the populists on the left are actually the majority holders in the government at the moment. Conte is sort of, you know, independent prime minister, but really he comes out of the Five-Star movement. Mm-hmm. And what he's experiencing actually, I think, is a good clue as to, you know, what might happen on the populist left. And when I say on the populist left, I mean, you know, a populist left that actually, does also believe in, you know, the will, you know, this overriding will of the people over technocracy, over, you know, ossified institutions and so on and so forth. So what we're seeing in Italy is really interesting, which is that, you know, the closer Conte gets to actually striking a deal that enables Italy to access recovery funds, you know, the stability mechanism in Europe and so on and so forth, you know, the more under stress he places his party, because actually the really left-wing faction of the Five-Star movement do not want to go down this road, which they see as the road of a dictatorial, technocratic Europe that doesn't have Italian and the Italian people's interests at heart. So, you know, he's in a difficult position precisely because of, you know, this resurgence on the left of his own party. Italy has to go through a set of votes, parliamentary votes, in order to agree to actually access, you know, the funds and so on. And these votes are not in the bag, right? So you have, you know, a Five-Star PM who actually may very well be brought down by the fact that the left wing of his own party and Salvini's Lega actually really agree on this. So, you know, you've got the potential coalition, you know, of these interests. In the case of France, Marine Le Pen has actually been relatively quiet. You know, she knows this is not her moment. On the other hand, somebody like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is you know, who would be, I suppose, the left wing populist, has been incredibly vocal in his criticism of Macron. Now, the point is that, you know, in France, being vocal against Macron is just, you know, it's a rather widespread pursuit. Let's put it this way. This is somebody who's under fire. But, you know, Mélenchon had actually gone down in the polls, and this crisis is actually benefiting him. It is giving him a podium, and, you know, it's allowing him to argue, you know, that the government is being incompetent, and also, particularly as France reopens and comes out of lockdown, that essentially, you know, risks are being taken with citizen lives in order to protect a liberal economy.
Yeah, okay. Paul, over to you. I mean, it flows in some ways from talk of Marine Le Pen, and obviously you've written an awful lot about Euroscepticism, and people are talking about the build-up of Euroscepticism within Italy. Do you see the EU's supposed, and I stress supposed, failure to kind of coordinate action on the economic consequences of the pandemic as a possible driver for increased Euroscepticism, both in Italy maybe and in other countries in the EU 27?
Yeah, well, I mean, you asked about what's the reaction of left populism, and if you look at Pablo Iglesias, the Podemos leader and the deputy prime minister of Spain, his answer is the EU needs to be doing more. So something that the left-wing populism is going up. But the larger question about what does it do for the European issue as a kind of populist, insofar as it is sometimes used in a populist way? How does it reinforce Euroscepticism? I find this quite difficult to get a handle on, if I'm honest with you, because you very carefully said that the supposed failure. I mean, in the sense, if you're a Eurosceptic, Europe has failed because it hasn't intervened, or because or what? I mean, in a sense, if the national boundaries and nation states are taking control of this, it sort of gives the lie that Europe is controlling our lives. So actually, I'm not sure it necessarily reinforces that. On the other hand, Ursula von der Leyen apologised for the European Commission President, apologised for Europe's bad treatment of Italy. There's kind of solidarity failures. So in a sense, the very heart, the core of the European elite establishment, it was almost setting itself up, especially that Catherine was talking about with the financial settlement and the difficulties it had for it. It's setting itself up as a target for Eurosceptic hostility. But in a sense, I don't quite understand why Europe should be expected to deal with this health crisis. I think sort of Europe is a mixture of the nation state and as a European integration level process, then it's horses for courses. And I'm not fully convinced that that Euroscepticism will become a huge weapon for the populists, but I could be wrong about that, and I do think that I'm wrong about many things, but I'm aware that that might be a growing impetus, but I don't see it at the moment. The other thing you have to bear in mind is this: people overstate the power of what I would call hard Euroscepticism. Hard Euroscepticism is where you say, I dislike the European project so much that I don't want my country to be a member of the European Union. In the UK, obviously, we have that, but there's very little hard Euroscepticism out there externally. I mean, if you really look at what the Eurosceptics say, even, and maybe Catherine can correct me, even Marine Le Pen is not advocating withdrawal. She's flirting with the idea of a referendum. But people tend to put Euroscepticism as the same thing. Criticising it is different from wanting to leave it, and I think too often we assume that all Euroscepticism is about wanting to leave the European Union, especially sitting in the country that we're currently sitting in. But that's to miss some of the nuance there.
Okay. Well, I mean, that takes me nicely back to Matt, actually, when we're talking about hard Euroscepticism, and the home of hard Euroscepticism in some senses being the UK, and it's led us out of the European Union. And that brings me to Nigel Farage. We've seen him recently supposedly allegedly, I have to be careful what I say, breaking lockdown, coming to East Sussex, I think, from Kent to talk about, illegal migration, etc. Do you think a populist politician like Nigel Farage, in some ways, struggles during this pandemic because it's crowded out the kind of issues that perhaps he's used to being able to mobilise opinion on? Matt?
I think it's similar to Catherine's point about Le Pen, in the sense that this isn't a crisis that naturally plays to what Farage is all about, which is why he's been trying to increase the salience of illegal migration. And I think anything that happens to him from this point on, he would consider to be a bonus point, if you like. He's got the referendum, he's got Brexit, essentially, even if it's not the type of Brexit that he wanted to see. I think he's personally aware that his legacy as such has been established, and in that sense, I don't think personally, I don't think he'll be a a major actor on the political landscape now in the way that he was previously. But if I can just briefly pick up on something that Paul has just said, I think the risk for the European Union, and it's sort of no surprises, I'm a little bit more sceptical perhaps than some on this, but the risk for the European Union here is that this crisis exacerbates the divergence between, to crudely put it, North and South. And I think looking at the polling in Italy for the last month or two, and I agree that polling in the context of an immediate crisis should be taken with a pinch of salt. But my current gut instinct is Italy will not only come out of this crisis a poorer country, but will also come out of this crisis as a more Eurosceptic country. Because those perceptions of solidarity, I think, are very real. And I think among ordinary Italians, there's a clear sense that they no longer even have the ability to invest in their economy in a way that might give them some reason to be optimistic about the future. And I think what's been remarkable to me, especially on social media over the last month, has been otherwise very pro-European commentators even now beginning to say that either this is going to move into a full-blown fiscal union, and we're going to actually see the economic integration alongside the political, or there's going to have to inevitably be some further type of contraction in the years ahead. Because to be honest, I mean, morally and ethically, what is going to happen to countries like Italy over the next decade, 2 decades, with the amount of debt, is just going to be unsustainable in my view.
Right, okay. Catherine, any response to that, knowing Italy as you do?
Well, I think that the reactions, particularly at the very beginning of the European recovery mechanisms in Italy, from actually, very pro-European commentators, very pro-European politicians, were quite striking. Some of them going as far as saying, well, we're just going to have to go at it alone, right? Now you make of that what you will, but the fact is that that is quite definitive language. I think to some extent, there was an element. This is Italy. There was an element of the performance piece in the sense that it was very important to send this message, and for Conte to allow for this message to emerge in order for the EU to take stock and realize that it needed to take significant steps. And I think that to some extent that's been in the short term effective. But I would just add one thing, which is not just on Italy, and on Italy I would say that I think it will take a lot to pull Italy out, but I think that it's quite clear that the wounds of the previous financial crisis and the banking crisis, Eurozone crisis, were not healed, and this was salt to those wounds, and that's quite clear. But on top of that, I think that we're not just going to see a north-south divide in Europe, which is a threatening, which is a source of tension, right? Whether it's an existential threat is a slightly different discussion, but actually it is a source of tension at a time where institutions may not be able to manage it so well. But there's also going to be an east-west divide in terms of how the money from the recovery funds get spent, right? In terms of whether it goes into traditional industries or whether it gets spent, in fact, in a kind of more climate-friendly transition and so on and so forth. That's an awful lot of tensions, at the heart of one political alliance.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. So I'm going to leave all of you with just one question. You have to answer it, even though it's completely unfair. I suggested at the beginning there's 3 responses to this, which was populists generally will benefit. Number 2, populists generally will actually suffer as a result of the pandemic. Or option 3, it's too complicated to be able to tell. And I'm going to go round and ask each of you in turn. So starting with Paul, 1, 2 or 3, populists up, populists down, or it's too complicated?
It's too complicated and it's too early to tell.
Okay, Catherine.
Sorry.
I actually, unfortunately, think populists up in the medium term.
Okay, and Matt, finally, you.
I agree with Paul. Too early to say, yeah.
Okay, I'd just like to thank you very, very much for giving up your time, all three of you. I'd like to thank all of you who've tuned in, as it were, if that's the right expression. If you have tuned in late or you want to pass on the fact that this is a Zoom event that would be worth looking at again, we will put it out on YouTube. We'll also put out an audio version on SoundCloud. UK and Changing Europe produces a podcast which comes out either every week or every couple of weeks. You can always listen to those as well. We're going to be putting on more of these Isolation Insight events. So if you've enjoyed this one, please do come back for more. And please do tell your friends and family whether you can see them in the flesh after Wednesday or not. Thank you very much. And we will end it there. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.